What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the new Blumhouse horror movie, Lee Cronin's The Mummy, which, as the title suggests, was written and directed by Lee Cronin. I don't know if his body of work is strong enough where he should be signing his movies. However, at least the title of this movie will help us differentiate it from all the other Mummy movies, going all the way back to 1932. And I have a feeling when we get to 2132, people will still be making movies about The Mummy because every once in a while you'll get one that is insanely popular.
The Mummy. Is it dead or alive? Human or inhuman? You'll know. You'll see.
But unfortunately, I don't think this interpretation of the Mummy story is strong enough where it's going to break through and become wildly popular. Lee Cronin's last movie, though, was pretty popular. Evil Dead Rise definitely got the Evil Dead franchise back on track. They're making a sequel to it right now. I think it actually comes out later this spring or summer. I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of Evil Dead Rise, and I'm more than happy to watch the original Evil Dead trilogy over and over again until the end of time. However, there were some people out there who really enjoyed Evil Dead Rise, and I do think Evil Dead Rise is a stronger movie than Lee Cronin's The Mummy for reasons that I'm about to break down. And I think the biggest impediment standing between Lee Cronin's The Mummy and becoming a successful horror film is Blumhouse itself. And obviously Blumhouse is very experienced at this point within the horror genre, but for people who have followed this channel for any length of time, they'll know that bashing Blumhouse is one of my favorite blood sports. For my money, Blumhouse makes horror movies for people who don't actually want to be scared or disturbed, but so much. The very same people who are relieved when the movies inevitably turn into action movies. And more often than not, when it comes to Blumhouse horror movies, the tone of the films always seems to suggest that the filmmakers taken the concept and their message just a tad too seriously. But let me pause to say something nice about Lee Cronin's The Mummy. I think it's a stronger Blumhouse movie than a lot of other Blumhouse movies in recent years. And the ones that I've seen over the last couple of years include Black Phone 2, Megan 2.0, Wolfman, which just totally sucked balls, Speak No Evil, a completely unnecessary and totally chicken shit remake of a European horror movie, and worst of all in recent years, The Exorcist Believer, a movie that was so bad I might have gone stark raving nuts until the end of time, if not for the fact that the movie was an abysmal failure. So it at least restored my sense of logic and reality and justice in the universe, that I was not alone in thinking that The Exorcist Believer was a strong contender for one of the biggest pieces of shit ever made in human history. And one of the big gaping flaws of this most recent Blumhouse movie, Lee Cronin's The Mummy, is that more often than not, it's trying to be kind of a thinly veiled Exorcist movie as opposed to a Mummy movie, or at least it's trying to kind of straddle that line. It's pulling some ingredients from The Mummy from 1932 and some subsequent adaptations, but it's also trying to recreate a lot of the beats and a lot of the vibes of William Friedkin's movie The Exorcist from the early 70s, and it fails utterly. But you might be justifiably asking yourself at this point, if I dislike Blumhouse movies so intensely, why do I keep going back for more? And the most obvious answer is, I'm crazy. I'm a glutton for punishment, and for whatever reason, every once in a while, I'll allow myself to be kind of lured in by a trailer where, when I saw the trailer for Lee Cronin's The Mummy, I'd say half of it, I was like, you know what? He might be onto something. It's kind of disturbing, kind of creepy. It's an interesting premise. It's an interesting framework overall. And within the trailer, there were certain beats, like when the mummy creature starts speaking to her grandma. I was like, oh, this is going to be god-awful. Like, you just tipped your hand, and I know what you're all about.
Don't worry, Grandma. It's fun to be dead.
But it did have enough scenes or enough moments where I was like, you know what, there might be some creepy stuff at play here, but here's the official story as written over on IMDb. The young daughter of a journalist disappears into the desert without a trace. 8 years later, the broken family is shocked when she is returned to them as what should be a joyful reunion turns into a living nightmare. And just to give you some additional context, the little girl goes missing when the family's living and working in Cairo, but 8 years later, they're living and working in New Mexico, which leads to one of the big problems of this movie, is that it ping-pongs back and forth quite a bit between Egypt and New Mexico, and on the Egypt front, you have an investigator trying to figure out who took this girl and why, and slowly but surely filling in kind of some of the lore for the audience. While back in New Mexico, we basically have an exorcist scenario where the family's doing everything in their power to try to look after her while she's crawling the walls like a spider and eating scorpions and headbutting everybody and biting everybody. And they're like, oh, she just needs love and care and attention. She's like, wow, wow. I mean, it's ridiculous how many passes they give her as her behavior becomes increasingly extreme. In any case, that is the framework that they went with. The problem is, though, because the movie's constantly cutting back and forth between these two side-by-side stories, it gives the audience kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card. When any time it's starting to get kind of disturbing or spooky or scary, they give you a chance to kind of and let you exhale as it goes off to this police procedural plot. over in Egypt, where it starts to feel a little bit more like a mystery story or a thriller. And I love mystery stories, I love thrillers, but if you're trying to scare the pants off the audience, you should only give them you should only give them but so many breaks or like moments of relief from the horror. But another big problem working against this movie is that it is 2 hours and 13 minutes long, and it feels much longer. And I was feeling the length. And there were like 2 or 3 moments at the end. I was like, oh, this is the emotional peak of the movie. They're going to wrap it up, and they're going to send us out like, devastated. But then it would go a little longer, and then a little longer. And it did the worst thing of all. Without giving away spoilers, it restores the status quo. If you want to get labeled as a chicken shit horror movie, like by me and by a lot of other horror fans who like their horror to go to deep, dark, disturbing places, you cannot let the audience walk off into the sunset. And when you look at a list of some of the all-time great horror movies, almost none of them restore the status quo at the end, like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or The Exorcist, or Rosemary's Baby, or Night of the Living Dead, or any of the essentials from the 60s and 70s that you care to mention. Nearly always, the status quo is not restored. Or The Omen, which has its 50th anniversary later this summer. Really good horror should allow the audience to just be thunderstruck and floored and terrified, where they kind of walk out into the street with their hands shaking like, oh my God, what did we just experience? And along those lines, if you want a very similar story in tone and atmosphere, but one that does just go for the jugular and just rips it out entirely, Dan Simmons' Song of Kali. The story's set in Calcutta, not in Cairo, but it's very similar in the sense that we have a young family with little kids where something horrible happens to one of the kids who gets abducted. And that story just gets darker and darker, so much so that nowadays, like 40 years later, people have basically like just gone right up to the edge of accusing Dan Simmons of like a hate crime, even by writing the thing. But he wrote a lot of great science fiction and a lot of great naval adventure stories. He wrote stories of every shape and size. But you want to talk about authors who come roaring out of the gate with a really good one? Song of Kali will fuck you up, and it pulls no punches, and like so much so I could never read it again. Like by the end of it, I just felt kind of sick. I was like, oh man, this book is wrong in many ways, but that's exactly the experience that I was looking for. Lee Cronin's movie, it's not wrong. It's just periodically gross, but it's gross without being scary, and that's a problem because my audience, they were clearly fired up and ready to go, but they were giggling at the gore because the gore is kind of extreme and over the top, but it's not disturbing, it's not upsetting, it's not creating a sense of like suspense or dread or terror. It's just like, oh, another person's barfing in a person's face, or another person's barfing on food before they eat it, or another person's yanking their teeth out and smiling. It's kind of silly gore, and that once again dispels any atmosphere of terror that the movie might have been successfully building up to those points. But what can I say that's nice about this movie? Well, I'll say this. I love a good old-fashioned, creepy sarcophagus story. At the core of this story is a sarcophagus that is 3,000 years old, and I don't know how many spoilers I should give away or not give away, but the movie does a pretty good job of leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that kind of fills in the story of what the sarcophagus has been getting used for all these years, and why this little girl shows up eight years after she goes missing, rotting away inside this sarcophagus.
She's been missing for 8 years. What was our daughter doing in a 3,000-year-old sarcophagus?
And if you're looking for a really good sarcophagus story and you're a fan of the fantasy genre, if you look over my shoulder, you'll see these 7 novels here by R. Scott Baker. And some people call it the No God series, some people call it the Second Apocalypse series, but it is 7 dark adult fantasy novels where at the core of it, one of the main villains, I'll just say that it involves a sarcophagus. And in the 21st century, when it comes to combining like horrific ingredients and fantasy ingredients, this series is my favorite of the 21st century. It's got almost no audience, but the audience that knows it loves it intensely. So anyway, I'm a sucker for a good sarcophagus story if it's employed well. And it's employed pretty well here, but shit. I guess I'm going to have like a mild spoiler section just to kind of explain why I'm frustrated. So last warning, 3, 2, 1, I'm going to go into very mild spoiler terrain. But as it turns out, the sarcophagus has been getting used for thousands of years to basically contain what amounts to a demon or a demonic force. And one of the only ways they can keep it trapped there is by periodically having it possess another living body, wrapping it up with all these kind of like bandages with all this like mystic writing on it, and that mystic writing kind of keeps it contained so it can't escape. And when that body runs out, you got to replace it with another. But as the daughters return to the family, and the daughters living in New Mexico and spending all this time periodically people are investigating those wrappings and looking into the writing, but that the wrappings are what's keeping like the demon contained, but there's nothing preventing the demon from just pulling off the bandages. And at the very end, she just starts pulling it off. It's like, well, you could have pulled this crap off at any point in time, but then people say, oh, but then the movie can't happen. That's sloppy writing. If you're taking shortcuts so that your climax happens when you want it to, as opposed to when it inevitably should, well, then once again, you should just go back to the drawing board and revisit the screenplay. And I feel like Lee Cronin, after the success of Evil Dead Rise, he was probably given too much trust and too much leeway for what amounts to a filmmaker who's still relatively inexperienced. He's made a lot of short films, many of which have been very popular, but as a feature filmmaker, he got very lucky with Evil Dead Rise. And sometimes when a filmmaker gets very lucky, they're allowed to indulge themselves, or they're allowed to not have too few drafts of a screenplay. They could perhaps use one or two more drafts to really tighten the screws and lock in on what's going to be the best story. Or maybe just Jason Blum over at Blumhouse just has terrible taste and doesn't feel like reading screenplays. But I would have recommended that The Mummy or Lee Cronin's The Mummy be a half hour shorter, if not more. And they probably could have streamlined the whole thing and just set the whole thing in Cairo. And that way they're not cutting back and forth between continents. They could have just really had a sense of a tight economical storytelling that's leading up to this devastating conclusion, and it would have allowed the climax to happen much more quickly. I really think it was a mistake dividing the story across two sides of the planet. But if I wanted to offer additional praise, the actress Laia Costa, who plays the mother in this, the first time I saw her was in a movie from 2015, a million years ago, called Victoria, a Spanish movie where the premise or the conceit of the movie was that through trickery, they created the illusion of one sustained shot over the entire running time of the movie. But she was terrific. I had not seen her in anything since then. So I enjoyed seeing her again. However, her part's a little underwritten, where it's one of those things where no matter how ridiculous her daughter's behaving, if the husband suggests, maybe we should take her to a doctor or to a specialist, she's like, are you saying I cannot look after my own daughter? Like, it's all this irrational anger, which doesn't make us think she's so wounded, or she's giving everything that she can to try to help her daughter. It just makes her seem a little naive and short-sighted. And then at a certain point, she's like, you know what? Maybe we should take her to see a specialist. But this movie does so many ridiculous things where something supernatural will happen, but then it just kind of pretends like the person who saw it didn't see it. Like, case in point, once again, I guess I got to go into heavy spoilers now. So big warning, 3, 2, 1. There's a funeral for the grandmother at one point who, shocker, is killed by the little mummy girl. And during the funeral, when there are a lot of people in the house, it's in the house, and all the friends and family come over. The house is full of people. And somehow, in spite of the fact that the mummy girl crawls through a hole, digs a hole through the ceiling, crawls into the funeral, drops into the coffin, and starts eating the dead grandmother and ripping off chunks of her flesh, nobody says anything or reacts. So we never even really see people running for cover. They just kind of shrug it off. Or there's a scene where the father is sitting in the room kind of looking after his little girl, and her wheelchair rises up off the ground and starts going dugong, dugong, and he just kind of goes and looks, but he never changes any of his behavior in spite of the fact that he's seeing this wheelchair rising up off the floor. And the actor who plays the father, hang on, his name is Jack Raynor, who people will recognize from the film Midsommar, the Ari Aster horror movie. He was terrific in Midsommar, less so here. He tends to react to every single crisis in the exact same way, where he just goes and makes this big wide-eyed face. It's like there are other ways to show shock, surprise, and alarm than just going. But he does it over and over and over again, and at a certain point it just gets repetitive and boring. And there are a few little moments where it's some genuine shock and revulsion would be warranted, like when the mummy is returned to New Mexico for whatever reason, or for an obvious reason, because you have a fucking mummy there. These jackals and coyotes and wolves start to kind of gather around the house and are constantly kind of stalking the place. And cool little bits that add additional atmosphere and style, which I was enjoying. And of course, because this is a Blumhouse horror movie, it inevitably turns into an action movie as opposed to a horror movie, because most Blumhouse horror movies in the final act, they just become kind of thrill rides where there's like explosions and screams and people running around. But if people are like headbutting each other and fighting and running around, it loses any sort of atmosphere of dread or suspense whatsoever, and it just becomes kind of like a roller coaster ride. And another problem this movie has is that as the mummy starts to become more powerful, it starts like possessing another sister and possessing the brother and possessing the corpse of the grandmother. So suddenly it's like kind of a wannabe Evil Dead movie. You can tell Lee Cronin, he likes The Exorcist and he likes The Evil Dead, and he's trying to recapture certain moments from those movies. And I love those movies too. They're fucking amazing. They are genuine horror classics, but the reason they're horror classics is because they broke new ground. They showed us stuff we had never seen before. And if you're just going to recycle, famous bits from other horror movies, well, then at most you're going to give people a 2-hour, 17-minute diversion or 13-minute diversion as opposed to a memorable horror movie. And speaking of memorable horror movies, what are the best mummy movies? I won't pretend that I'm like some giant like mummy fanatic, but I've seen a few good interpretations. Like the original from 1932, directed by Karl Freund, who was a great DP in Germany before he came to America and became a director. But anytime you have Boris Karloff, well, you're off to the races. But I remember as a kid watching it thinking, well, how come the mummy's only in the movie for like 5 seconds? Because once the mummy escapes, he takes the bandages off and he just looks like a normal guy. But it's still a very atmospheric scene in the beginning when the mummy is first revealed. Superman fought some interesting Egyptian people that are at least involved with the mummy in the early Fleischer Brothers animated shorts from the early 40s. And if you've never seen those animated shorts, they're some of the best animated shorts ever made. Hammer Horror got in on the action back in 1959. I think they were more successful with Dracula and Frankenstein and some of the other iconic monsters out there. But their interpretation of the mummy is worth a look if you're a fanatic for the creature. But the reality is, maybe my favorite on-screen version of the mummy might have been when I was 11 years old and I saw the Monster Squad. And I have not revisited the Monster Squad in decades, but when I was like 11 or 12 years old and it was playing on HBO at the time, that was my kind of gateway drug into a lot of the classic Universal monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, the Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon, or Gillman, whatever you want to call him. But that was a great way of kind of getting accustomed to all of them. Although I did see a lot of them in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is another great gateway drug. So sometimes a little action, comedy, and horror is a great way to get kids into this stuff. But the Mummy and Monster Squad was pretty cool. And then, of course, we got the Brendan Fraser action movies. And The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. Those are not horror movies at all. They are special effects action movies. Very popular. I would say I enjoyed them, but I don't rewatch them compulsively. But I believe they're making a third. We got Bubba Hotep from 2002 for all the Bruce Campbell fans out there. That movie's fucking hilarious, and I definitely recommend people check it out. And then there was that recent attempt at creating like a dark universe at Universal where a bunch of different filmmakers were going to tackle these classic monsters, and they were going to be part of a shared universe like Marvel. And one of those was The Mummy with Sofia Boutella back in 2017, also with Tom Cruise. I did not see the movie because I basically, after I saw the trailer where they had failed to mix the sound properly, there was no coming back from that. And for people who don't remember, 9 years ago, the trailer got unveiled, but it didn't have like the music or the sound effects. It just had some of the vocal tracks, but nothing else. And it was weird, but like weird in a hilarious way where you're like, this is like the greatest trailer I've ever seen. Why would I want to see a movie that takes itself too seriously when I can just watch this bizarre trailer, which is still online? You'd think that Universal would find a way to purge the internet of that trailer, but it is still out there, and I'm happy to share a piece of it here.
No.
But getting back to Lee Cronin's The Mummy, the most obvious criteria by which you can judge a horror movie is, was it scary? Did you get your money's worth? And I absolutely did not. And obviously there's some horror movies that can be more comedic, and there's some horror movies that can be more sci-fi, and they can give you some different ingredients. Lee Cronin's The Mummy is trying to be spooky. It's trying to be a big, serious, like horror movie full of gravitas and suspense and that sort of thing. And it's partially successful at times, but other times comes across as unintentionally stupid. And yeah, by the end of it, I was fucking sick and tired of it and ready to go home and talk a little trash. But like I said at the beginning of the video, it is at least better than a lot of other Blumhouse movies. It is definitely better than The Exorcist Believer. It is definitely better than fucking Speak No Evil. It is light years better than Wolfman, which is just totally unendurable. And maybe just a smidge better than Black Phone 2, which had its moments, but once again, Black Phone 2, same problem. The last act is an action movie. Like it turns almost into like an Avengers movie. It's like, do y'all not read horror or watch horror? Action is the death or the enemy of horror. And yeah, name any great horror movie you can think of. Like the heroes of the story are not like muscle-bound heroes, like, kicking ass. Or if they are, it turns into something quite different. Like if you watch Evil Dead 2, An Army of Darkness, there's a transformation of Ash over the course of those movies. He's kind of a weenie, like little coward in the first one. And he spends most of the movie getting his ass kicked. And then in the second one, he starts transforming into Ash the Badass and getting the chainsaw hand. But the moment he gets a chainsaw hand and the sawed-off shotgun, it ain't a horror movie anymore. It's not even trying to be. And then obviously it's like a fantasy comedy by the time you get to the third movie. So yeah, people just need to remember what lane they are in when they're trying to create certain stories. But once again, if you want a really spooky story about a family with a little girl gone missing in the Far East, Song of Kali will absolutely, it'll like rip your spinal cord out and shove it down your throat. And it's like, yep, that's what you get for reading Song of Kali. But on that note, I'm going to wrap this sucker up. Hope you enjoyed my little rant. If so, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell, becoming a subscriber, all that good stuff. Hope everybody has a great weekend at the movies, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.